Today, we're going to compare two different crochet pumpkin patterns that are made very differently from each other and come out looking quite different and compare the end results. I'm May, and this is May's Crochets. I'm a beginner crocheter sharing my learning to crochet journey. In a recent video, I made pumpkins following a pattern. I actually made 4 of them to compare the yarn over versus yarn under techniques in Amigurumi. So I made 4 pumpkins following that pattern in order to compare the 4 different combinations of yarn over and yarn under. I will link that video here if you want to take a look. That was a really fun experiment to do, and I've gotten some really interesting feedback on opinions from other people about yarn under versus yarn over. But so that pattern was really just a ball. You make a ball and then you use yarn to wrap around to make the different segments of the pumpkin. And so it's kind of a really basic amigurumi ball. You kind of start with a magic ring, do some increasing, single crochet down, do some decreasing and close the ball. And then you use the yarn to kind of wrap it around to turn it into that pumpkin shape versus like it really just starts off as a ball in a very simple way. So I was looking online at pumpkin patterns and figured I would start with that one, and that was the perfect vehicle to test out the sort of a yarn under versus yarn over experiment. But as I was looking, I also came across these other pumpkin patterns that were made in just a totally different way, and I thought it would be really interesting to make one of those so that we can compare the end result side by side. So the other pattern that I followed that I want to show you today came from Sarah Maker, and it's made in a totally different way from the amigurumi ball. So this one, you chain and you crochet into the chain, kind of back and forth, chain and turn, and you end up with like a panel that's almost like a rectangle, and then you like sew the two halves together, and then you sort of shape it in that way into a pumpkin. I'm going to get into all the details in a minute, but it's not that same sort of amigurumi round. You're making this panel the way you almost would make like a scarf, or like a rectangular blanket or sort of that shape, and then you do some stuff to kind of attach it and turn it into a pumpkin. So I just thought that was so interesting that there's these two totally different ways to both make pumpkins, and they end up looking really different. And so I wanted to share my results with you today. So let me first show my kind of yarn over, yarn under ball pumpkins. Here's the one in the same color. So this is this sort of light orange. This one was made yarn under, yarn over, which came out looking really neat. So again, this was just the ball. This is from my last video. And then you can see there's like yarn here that is turning it into these different segments of the pumpkin. But this is just standard, single crochets. And this is much more sort of standard amigurumi. So this was from last time. So now today's pattern that was more of the chain and then assembling, crochet and then assembling, came out looking like this. Let's take a look. So look at that texture. Isn't that so interesting? Here is what it looks like from the outside. Here's the top, the bottom. And let's take a closer look again at just the way these stitches come out compared to this one. Okay, so I want to talk through this one that I made for this video. So this is again from Sarah Maker. And so let's get into the details of actually how this is made. And I just think this is so interesting that they come out similar, but the outsides are so different. And like, how do you make something that's so similar two totally different ways? So like I was saying, you start off with just a chain, and then you crochet into the chain kind of the same pattern over and over and over again, and you're chaining and turning at the end the way that I think you make like a blanket or a scarf, although I've never actually made one of those in crochet. I've been very focused on amigurumi, and so the pattern is pretty simple. You have on the outside, so you do some slip stitching, some single crochets, and then some half double crochets, sort of the most half double crochets in the middle, and then some single crochets, and then some slip stitches at the end. So there's sort of like a pattern where the middle is a whole bunch of half double crochets, and then on each side of that, there's fewer single crochets, and then on the very ends there's some slip stitches. And so you do that over and over and over again, and it makes this rectangular panel, or it's not really a rectangle because of the half double crochets. I'll show a picture, I think here or here. That is what the panel actually looked like before I attached it all. It ended up, because of the slip stitching single crochet and half double crochet, it kind of made this zoops shape, because the half double crochets are so much wider. And so you end up with this whole panel. It's like, I think it's like 34 rounds. And then you fold the two halves together, or fold it over, fold your panel over, and you attach the two ends. So you can do slip stitch, just crochet down to attach the two ends. And then you have sort of this rectangle. And then the fun part, you kind of stitch around the top, or I guess the bottom of the pumpkin, either way, to basically catch the edges all the way around. So you have a string going all the way around, and then you like pull it tight and that like cinches the top or the bottom together. So it's almost like a drawstring bag. You're like stitching all the way around with this piece of yarn to basically make a ring all the way around, and then you just pull and it like closes up. It cinches the whole pumpkin top or bottom together, and it's a kind of a fun little effect that I kind of didn't know was a thing that you could do, that it's like instead of like stitching it together, you're just like putting the string all the way around and then pulling it, and it just like zoop, it closes up, which is really cool. It doesn't close all the way, and then you kind of have to do a little bit of extra stitching to close the hole like all the way in the end. So here's my bottom that it's a little bit, came out a little bit messy in the end once I totally finished it. But yeah, that was kind of fun, the little cinching technique. And then you do the same thing on the top. Go around, cinch, and it closes up that top too. And then so you end up with like this sort of shape, and the top and the bottom are each flat. And then you can do, it's kind of similar to what I did for this one. You can do sort of some shaping, they say, where you put the needle kind of all the way through to the top, pull it back to the bottom, pull it back to the top, and you're pulling tight every time. So you end up kind of pushing the top and the bottom in a little bit each to make that little concave shape. And so you end up with a little bit more of a pumpkin shape. So that part, the sort of shaping was sort of similar to this. And then the stems I made the same way. But really the rest of the pumpkin construction was just so different. And they end up, they do look quite different from the outside, although the shape in the end is like very similar. And I just think was such an interesting way to compare sort of these two very different patterns. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the details on this pattern. I have found myself maybe like improvising a little bit more, or like, I feel like in the past I've been very like, I'm a perfectionist. I want to follow exactly line by line, like exactly what the pattern says. This one was a written pattern, not a video tutorial. And I actually have found other very quite similar pumpkin patterns out there that had video tutorials, and I followed kind of some of the details on those in the final steps of like doing the cinching and stuff, although the video that I watched as compared to the actual written pattern did them in very different ways. And so I kind of improvised maybe a little bit of both to try to kind of come up with my own way of doing it. But I do feel like as I'm like learning more and more, I'm just sort of figuring out what works for me, what feels the most comfortable for me, and kind of figuring out like, okay, that's the one I'm going to go with. And there's different ways clearly to accomplish the same thing. So that was kind of fun. I did see so it's so interesting that all of these patterns, like there's a lot of different versions of the same, pattern out there. I happen to follow, it was DIY Fluffies who made this pattern, but I've since seen plenty of other quite similar patterns for pumpkins where you make the circle and then you do the segments. And same with this one, I followed the Sarah Maker pattern for the most part, and that was my inspiration. But then I saw there's like actually a quite different or a quite similar pattern on the Hobie website that's a free pumpkin pattern, although that one, just like the way that the rectangle segment is constructed is a little different. So again, this one was like slip stitch, single crochet, half double crochet, single crochet, slip stitch, versus the one I think on the Hobie website was much more standard. I think maybe it was all half double crochet. And actually the video that I ended up watching also was all half double crochet. And then you end up with a true rectangle, fold it over, do the cinching, and it comes out looking pretty similarly. I think it would be interesting to make that pattern to compare it to this one, because this one has those slip stitches and single crochets on the end and then half double crochet only in the middle. So I wonder if that makes it a little bit more like, I don't know, like the shape is maybe a little bit more pumpkin-y because the middle has that really thick sort of half double crochet stitch, but the tops and the bottoms have the smaller slip stitch and single crochet, as opposed to if it's all half double crochet, maybe like in the very bottom and the very top have like wider stitches. So I actually think I might like this one better, but I have to, make it to actually compare. But it is interesting that there's just like a lot of versions of kind of the same thing, out there, but that's okay. We can find different versions and test out different versions and see what we like for ourselves. I will say I had a little bit of trouble with the slip stitching. I have had this problem in the past too with slip stitches where I find myself splitting the yarn a little bit. I should say I made this pumpkin with Premier Basics worsted weight. It's getting very messy since I've been working with it, but that's the same yarn that I made this pumpkin with. And overall, I love this yarn, and I don't find it to be too splitting, but for some reason with slip stitches is when I often find myself getting the yarn a little bit split. And you can see in my other video too, my when I tried yarn under for my second stitch, I also struggled with splitting. So it just seems to depend on exactly what the stitch is. But for slip stitching in the past, I've had this problem, and I had the problem again on that sort of the ends of my chains, or the ends of my rows, where it ends up really with these kind of tight little stitches because it's just a slip stitch, and then actually going back into it, I had trouble kind of getting the hook in because it was this tight little stitch, and I would find it splitting, and I would have trouble like when I did the slip stitch all the way through pulling, I would end up splitting it. So what I've done in the past, which I feel a little like cheating, but oh well, it accomplishes it, is like I'll literally just like use my hand to like pull the stitch over, because when I'm with the hook pulling the stitch through, I find myself splitting, versus if I use my hand to kind of pull the outside stitch all the way up and over, I have a little more control over not splitting it. I probably should work on that. That does feel like it's kind of cheating. It's like not really crochet. I should actually use the hook for what I want. I probably was doing my stitches a little too tight, because I found like when I had a little bit of looser stitches, I did not have a problem just kind of gliding it right through and not splitting. So that was interesting. It's funny how this happens. Like my first 10 rounds, I was like going smoothly, like everything was great. I like put it down for the night and I picked it up the next morning. And for some reason at that point, I ended up with this problem kind of at the end of every row with slipping, the slip stitches causing me problems. And I ended up like the wrong number because I maybe missed because it was such a small stitch, and I had to like count and do it over and over and over again. And then I kind of picked it back up. Maybe I loosened my stitches a little bit, and then it was like smooth sailing from there. So I just think that's so funny how like this happens to me a lot where like everything's fine, and then I somehow like somewhere in the middle kind of get messed up on a little bit of a thing, and then it takes a little bit of time to recover and kind of get back to normal. So I don't know, but always a good learnings. I've never done anything like this before, so always learning. Another little like sort of cheat, whatever, something technique that I figured out that I have used a little bit before is like if I have a stitch that's really tight, like these slip stitches on the end that I can't get my hook through, I take a much smaller hook. So this was made with a 3.5 millimeter crochet hook. I took my smallest hook, which is I think it's a 2.25 millimeter hook. So it's a way smaller. And I put that hook through the stitch and like pull a little bit to just kind of like open up that stitch, because the smaller hook can fit through. It has sort of a much smaller kind of sharper end. Pull it through, open up the stitch a little bit, and then it's easier for me to go through with the full 3.5 millimeter size. So that's like a little, I don't know, I'm not gonna say cheating. It accomplishes the same, thing in the end, and whatever works, right? So, but I've been figuring out these little techniques that I can use to kind of get me where I want to go. So, and then in the end, let's see what else. The stem, I actually made the same stem in the same way as this one. I like the way this stem came out, and I kind of went with that here too. Her pattern, she made the stem in a very different way, where it's a lot of double crochets and I think it's like front post double crochets. And I tried to do it. I kind of did a few rounds of it, and I didn't love how it was looking. And then in the end, I thought, let me just make the stem the same way as I did here, because I like how those came out, and I want to keep maybe the focus on how the actual pumpkin-like body is different. Although then once I finished it and actually sewed it on and I looked again at the pattern, I saw that the way that those front post double crochets were made, actually gives the stem a sort of stitched look, kind of like the pumpkin body. So now I kind of regret that I didn't like figure it out and stick with it to make this entire pumpkin that same sort of stitched look, but I'd already sewn it on, so oh well, we'll go with it. And you know, maybe next time I will try to make the stem that same way. But it's so interesting. Like it is more of a knitted look, don't you think? Like so that knitting would maybe come out this way a little bit more. Or I guess it's sort of that same idea that crocheting like a blanket or something, that where you're doing more like half double crochets and things. It is such a different look from this one. So yeah, I wanted to kind of compare the different pumpkins, see which one I like better. If I had to choose, I think I'll say that I like the process of making this one better. This is the more sort of standard amigurumi ball, probably because it's something that I'm more comfortable with doing the rounds. Maybe it's a little easier. So this one, I would say the process of making it, I think I enjoyed better. But the actual end result, I think I'm going to say that I like this sort of chain crochet, crochet, crochet method better, because it comes out with a much more interesting texture that looks like, it looks kind of like fancy. It looks like knitted, but it wasn't all that hard to do. I also find myself, I find myself enjoying doing like half double crochets and double crochets. Like it feels like a little bit more like, I don't know, it's like a little more complicated. And so something about it almost actually feels a little more like knitting or something, where you're like doing something more complicated to kind of get the yarn in and out and in and out versus like single crochet or something. But yeah, just two different ways to do something very similar. And so we can compare them side by side and see how they came out. Let me know in the comments which one you like better. And have you ever made something kind of in this same type of pattern as compared to this one? And which one do you like doing better versus which one do you think looks better? Yeah, so I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for keeping me company, and I'll see you next time. Bye.